Good evening. Thanks to those of you who are joining live and those of you who will be watching the recording. I appreciate you taking the time to do so. Welcome to Global Conflict and Cooperation, our workshop for Thursday evenings. Note that our workshop's every Thursday from 8 to 8:30. And on the PowerPoint, you'll see that if you want to watch past recordings, just click on the link and it'll take you to the video. Now, this workshop's a new series that I'm developing. It's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. So over the past couple of weeks, we first talked about an overview of the workshop and bringing in two big concepts of conflict and cooperation. In week 2, we focused on regional conflict and cooperation. And then in week 3, we looked at operationalizing cooperation. So bringing this concept from our mind as an idea into the real world. And now for week 4, we'll be looking at operationalizing conflict. So our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First, by the end of the workshop, you'll be able to define operationalization. Secondly, identify at least one database, one event related to international conflict. Let me change that. And to identify at least one international conflict of interest to you. So conflict, right? So conflict is a concept or an idea. And in order to bring this concept into the real world, we need to operationalize it. And operationalization is the process of converting a theoretical concept into an empirical referent. And an empirical referent is a person, place, or thing that exists in the real world. So some non-political science example of operationalizing concept, just so we can practice using this process. First is the concept of sincerity. So some operationalizations of sincerity include, offering condolences to someone who's lost a loved one, offering help to those who need it. For example, someone's car is broken down on the road and they're looking for assistance, or being honest with someone when they ask you, what's the prognosis or what's the situation, or, how am I faring in a particular circumstance? So sincerity is the idea, right? And you bring them into the real world by these three things, obviously among others. Now, another concept is happiness. Right. So some operationalizations of happiness include like literally smiling, right? Cheese. Buying your first car, you're probably gonna be pretty happy when that happens. Paying off your credit card, that's always fun, seeing that balance down to 0. And then lastly, getting married, right? So each of these are like the idea of happiness, and then how does this happiness manifest itself in the real world? So now we've practiced this process of operationalizing. Let's bring it into the concept of conflict. So our concept is conflict, and some operationalizations of it include intrastate conflict. This means within a particular country's borders or boundaries. This is also known as a civil conflict. Secondly, you have interstate conflict. So this is between two countries. Most of the times they share a land or water border, but sometimes they don't. We have regional conflict, which engulfs at least 3 different entities. They don't necessarily need to be state actors. So for example, if there's some kind of separatist movement within a country that spills over into other countries in the region, then that can be considered a regional conflict. And then lastly, global conflict. So this is where but a lot of the world is battling it out. Some examples of this obviously were World War I and World War II as global conflicts. Now, when we think of operationalizing conflict, we can look about it in different dimensions. So in the prior example, we just said interstate conflict, intrastate conflict, regional conflict, global conflict. This doesn't necessarily mean war in a military sense. There are other dimensions of conflict. So for example, there can be a political conflict, an economic conflict, a social conflict, a cultural conflict, a religious conflict. And the one we're more familiar with is military conflict, because in many ways that term is rooted in the notion that there's a military conflict between within a country or between countries. Now, what I'd like to do is share a couple of events or examples to help demonstrate how conflict can be brought into the real world, and is in a contemporary sense. So the first one is announced today, President Biden ending the war in Afghanistan. And what I like to do is pull up the C-SPAN recording of his speech and of his back and forth with the press, and we'll play a bit of this to get a sense of how the president's framing the end of this interstate conflict.
Good afternoon. Earlier today, I was briefed by our senior military and national security leaders on the status of the drawdown of U.S. forces and allied forces in Afghanistan. When I announced our drawdown in April, I said we would be out by September, and we're on track to meet that target. Excuse me. Our military mission in Afghanistan will conclude on August 31st. The drawdown is proceeding in a secure and orderly way, prioritizing the safety of our troops as they depart. Our military commanders advised me that once I made the decision to end the war, we needed to move swiftly to conduct the main elements of the drawdown. And in this context, speed is safety. And thanks to the way in which we have managed our withdrawal, no one U.S. forces or any forces have been lost. Conducting our drawdown differently would have certainly come with an increased risk of safety to our personnel. To me, those risks were unacceptable. And there was never.
So that's the president introducing his statement on the ending of war in Afghanistan. I'll go ahead and jump to these other two stars to give more context, and then we'll continue on.
Once that agreement with the Taliban had been made, staying with a bare minimum force was no longer possible. So let me ask those who want us to stay, how many thousands more Americans' daughters and sons are you willing to risk? How long would you have them stay? Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? Would you send your own son or daughter? After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome. The United States cannot afford to remain tethered to policies created in response to a world as it was 20 years ago. We need to meet the threats where they are today. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized beyond Afghanistan. So, we are repositioning our resources and adapting our counterterrorism posture to meet the threats where they are now, significantly higher in South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But make no mistake, our military and intelligence leaders are confident they have the capabilities to protect the homeland and our interests from any resurgent terrorist challenge emerging or emanating from Afghanistan. We are developing a counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on any direct threats to the United States and the region and act quickly and decisively if needed. We also need to focus on shoring up America's core strengths to meet the strategic competition with China and other nations that is really going to determine our future.
So the president goes on to explain why the shift has been made and why the changes are necessary going forward. So when it comes to operationalizing conflict, in this statement that the president's making, he's describing what that conflict, the rationale for it when it began, what it's endured or experienced over the past 2 decades now, and then why he's seeking to conclude that conflict. And so these are the types of challenges that leaders of countries face when it comes to conflict, and in this case, a military conflict. All right, what I'd like to do next is to connect this, obviously, with other conflicts that are happening. So you can see that it isn't just any single conflict in isolation, but that they're nested and connected with each other. So before I do, I just want to clarify, in case you're asking, where is Afghanistan? Right, here's a map of it. It's located in Central Asia, and to the west of the country is Iran, and to the east of the country is China and India, and to the north of it is Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Russia. Now, what I like to bring in next is this conflict between the United States and Russia. So we zoom our map out and we see here United States on one side of the Atlantic and Russia on the other side of the Atlantic. And between these two powers, we have the European Union and the Middle East and North Africa. Now, in connecting back with Afghanistan, I wanted to share this article titled "How Putin Could Jam Up Biden's Post-Afghanistan Plan." So we're going to open up this article, and we'll have it. I'll have it read a bit of these paragraphs to us.
The U.S. may need the help of an old foe in extricating itself from America's longest war, Vladimir Putin. The Biden administration has in recent weeks quietly engaged Central Asian governments in the hope of using one or more of the countries as bases after the withdrawal is complete. The U.S. has two main requests: a staging post for keeping an eye on terrorist activity in Afghanistan, and temporarily hosting thousands of Afghans seeking visas. Uzbekistan. But Moscow could use its significant economic and military influence in the region to jam up those plans, U.S. officials and experts say. The dual questions of how to continue fighting terrorists and safeguard Afghans who worked with American forces after the U.S. withdrawal became more urgent on Friday, as the last U.S. troops left Bagram Air Base, the largest military base in Afghanistan, and the hub of the U.S. war there for nearly 2 decades. As of Tuesday, the U.S. military had completed 90% of the withdrawal, according to U.S. Central Command. The proposal was on the agenda on Thursday, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken met at the State Department with his counterparts from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, the two most likely of the 6 Central Asian countries U.S. military planners are eyeing for the scheme, according to a congressional source. Both border Afghanistan and would allow for quicker access to the country than existing U.S. bases in the Middle East and aircraft carriers hundreds of miles away in the Persian Gulf. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also met with the Tajik foreign minister on Friday. Meanwhile, Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan, traveled to those countries in May. Readouts from Blinken's Friday meetings did not mention the proposal, but noted that the officials agreed ending the Afghanistan conflict would benefit the region. Most read. This would not be the first time the United States has stationed troops in Central Asia to support the Afghan war. After the September 11, 2001, attacks, the U.S. military used 2 bases, one each in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, for Afghanistan operations. Both bases were later shut down amid unrest and pressure by the Kremlin, which has increasingly viewed the U.S. presence in the region with suspicion.
And so we see here, the article goes on to describe what the Vladimir Putin's interest is in basically not having the United States in the Central Asian region, and how our desire to maintain a presence in the region, given that Afghanistan was a haven for terrorist activities back in the 90s and early 2000s, and how our presence has basically mitigated that. But now that we're withdrawing and ending that war, what it might mean for a resurgence in terrorist activities in that country. And so here's a dynamic, right, where obviously the United States and Afghanistan have been in this conflict, and then the United States exits, but it isn't just exiting and we're done, right? There is a smorgasbord, there is a chessboard of actors and actions and moves that need to be made in order to deal with the consequences of ending the war. So in addition to the Russia playing this role of maybe spoiling our ability to maintain a presence in Central Asia, the United States is also countering as well. So here's another article about a U.S. Navy warship leading drills in Russia's backyard, and particularly the Black Sea. And there might be an ad here, so
Only
we'll just give this a
9% of
moment.
plastic is recycled, no matter how.
So I'll let the ad play. You guys gotta give it a moment or two here.
Tensions remain high in the Black Sea after a confrontation last month between a British warship and the Russian military. Russian planes buzzed the British destroyer and issued hostile warnings. All of it happened in the same region where the U.S. and dozens of countries are now holding military exercises. Russia recently threatened to bomb foreign warships that pass through what it considers to be its territorial waters off of Crimea. An American destroyer, the USS Ross, departed the port of Odessa to lead those military drills, and Holly Williams is the only U.S. network correspondent on board.
We're sailing about 5,000 miles away from the east coast of the US. But as America's relationship with Russia has deteriorated, the Black Sea, which is Russia's backyard, has become a potential flashpoint. US sailors opened fire on a hostile craft, took aim at enemy warplanes and came under attack from fighter jets. But this was just a simulation, a live-fire military exercise with 28 US allies. Yet America's real-life rival appeared to be keeping careful watch. 4 Russian ships took it in turns to shadow the USS Ross. Russian fighter jets repeatedly circled nearby. Commander John D. John is a 20-year veteran of the Navy and told us he wasn't concerned. It would take much more than this to provoke a clash.
If somebody opened fire on you, then that would warrant you taking self-defense measures. If somebody is aggressive, then and you feel threatened, then you have the right to defend yourself.
Last month, a British naval ship, the HMS Defender, was subjected to more hostile tactics in the Black Sea. The UK government denied Russia's claims that it dropped bombs in the British ship's path and fired warning shots. But the Russian military did threaten to attack.
If you don't change the course, I'll be fired.
As tensions between the US and Russia have ratcheted up, the Black Sea region has become the scene of confrontations. Russia sent soldiers to illegally seize control of the Crimean Peninsula from neighbouring Ukraine in 2014. And Russia claims the British ship was sailing in what are now its territorial waters. The US and its allies don't recognise that. Russia's threatened to bomb foreign warships that sail into those waters in future. The training exercise was several miles away, and the USS Ross is heavily armed with Tomahawk and Harpoon missiles and torpedoes. Commander John calls it the Swiss Army knife of US warships.
You can hit a plane, you can hit an enemy submarine, you can hit an enemy destroyer.
That's exactly right.
You can do all of that.
That's exactly right.
During this exercise, the US Navy used that might to reassure its allies.
The message that it sends is that international airspace, international water space is for everybody. It doesn't belong to one country.
The US says it's committed to maintaining security in the Black Sea, and that's crucial for America's friends in this region, many of them countries living in close proximity to Russia and fearing Russian encroachment. For CBS This Morning, Holly Williams on board the USS Ross.
So we see now that it isn't just between two countries or between two powers, right? But that there's a dynamic amongst them that invoke different parts of this geography, different allies, supposed enemies, supposed enemies, and it's all very complex, right? But all this can be viewed in the spectrum of conflict. In this case, this is all within the military dimension, but you start to see that and think that, well, can't just be military. It's not like we're just sending Navy warships and Air Force fighters and Army and Marines into different regions of the world, but it's a part of a political dynamic. It's a part of a cultural dynamic. It's a part of these other dimensions of conflict that exist in a very complex and in an archaic world. So just in case, for those of you, where's the Black Sea? It's right here again in Central Asia. To the north is Ukraine and Moscow. To the south is Turkey. To the east is Georgia, and to the west is Bulgaria, Romania, and the Mediterranean Sea. So with that, some questions to think about, and then we're going to get to our discussion is, what international conflict are you interested in, and why are you interested in that particular international conflict? So with that, I'll go ahead and stop recording, and thank you to those who participate and or watch the video. So take care and have a great time or a great night.